Welcome, Jordan Gardner. Thanks for spending time with us at TribalFootball. This is Jordan. He's the chairman of Danish First Division side Helsingor, co-owner at Dundalk in Ireland, and an investor at Swansea City, a man who clearly loves the game of football. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries. Now, I just want to get stuck into Helsingor first off. They finished fourth last season in the Danish First Division. How are the pre-season preparations going, and how confident are you the club can take the next step this season by winning promotion?
Yeah, no, it's been a pretty short off season. Our last season ended at the end of May, and we start back up next week. So it's less than 2 months, so it's quick. But we've added a couple new players in the transfer window. We brought back almost the entirety of our current squad, and our coaching staff and everyone is under contract for at least one year. Several players and staff are under contract for multiple years. So
Okay.
we're in a really good place. A lot of the other clubs in our division are not stable right now. They're changing coaches and having ownership issues and financial problems, but we're kind of just stable and chugging along. And so I'm optimistic we can build on the momentum we had in the spring season where we had a lot of success and transition that into next season. It's too early to tell what that'll look like, but there's a lot of confidence that we're going to go out and have a very good season.
Can you tell us a bit about the town and the club itself, the fan base and stuff like that for people who don't know much about it?
Yeah, Helsingor's a community that's about 45 minutes north of Copenhagen. It's a relatively new club. FC Helsingor was founded in 2005. We have a new stadium that opened last year in 2019, which obviously we haven't really got to use that much with our supporters because of COVID and the restrictions on game days. But we have a pretty small but passionate fan base. And so it's a really cool and exciting club. Before we got the club in 2017-18, they made a run to the Danish Superliga. So that was
Yep.
exciting, and that was pretty attractive to us. For us, we're kind of one step away, one good season away from making that jump again. So
Mm-hmm.
after August 1st, right now, the restrictions, the COVID restrictions on spectators are lifted in Denmark. So we're excited to get our fans back in the games, back at the games. And so, yeah, I think that's like a little bit of a short version of the background of the club.
Have they embraced you, the local community there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a little bit of a feeling out period at first. It was a little bit difficult, right? As we bought the club, it got relegated. So there was a little bit of a challenge there. But over the last, I would say, year and a half, we've had a lot of success. We got the club promoted. And then last season, we finished fourth out of 12 teams, which was pretty unexpected. Our budget
Right.
was at the bottom of the division. So I think now there's a lot of respect for what we've done and brought to the club and the kind of ambition that we have to keep elevating the club. So I think it was kind of, it's a lot of communities you see is people want to, kind of see proof of concept, show that you can do what you say you're going to do. And we've done that over a period of 2 to 3 years. So I think we're in a good place now. It certainly was a different conversation at the beginning, but for where we are today is very, very good.
Yeah, you say at the beginning, did you know the club was in the financial problems it was in before taking over? And are you satisfied now where that financial footing is?
Uh, we knew some of it. We didn't know as bad that it was as bad as it was. Obviously, we could probably underestimated a little bit how difficult a relegation would be in terms of the reductions in revenues and all that. And
Right.
then, of course, you throw COVID on top of that. I'm
Mm.
reasonably happy with where we're at now, all things considering. We're coming out of COVID to a certain extent. We'll see how things go there.
Mm.
It's still been difficult because the transfer market's not where it was. We'll
Mm.
see. Hopefully, we can get as many spectators back as we had before, but we don't know what that looks like. So it's a little bit too early to tell where it's at. But certainly, we're feeling in a much better place than we were, 6, 12, 18 months ago.
With the transfer market, before you took over the club, you mentioned signing US players, developing them, and then selling them on. Is that still part of your plan? And have you had any hurdles or challenges in achieving that goal?
I mean, COVID has really kind of put the brakes on that because it's been really challenging to get American players over. So we've had to
Right.
focus mostly on the domestic player market and certainly within Scandinavia. And so I think now we can bring foreign players, including Americans, over. So we'll probably start to open that back up a little bit. But we've had a lot of success focusing within Scandinavia. So I think for the short
Right.
term, that's where we're going to continue to focus. You see a lot of young Americans heading to Europe. So there's absolutely no reason we might not land some of those players, but that's not our sole focus anymore now.
Are you happy with your local scouting network then? Is that credit to them finding those players in Scandinavia?
Yeah, I mean, we have a sporting staff. Our sporting director is very, very dialed in, specifically domestically in Denmark. So we've done a very, very good job recruiting domestically. I have networks in other places in Sweden. We have a couple players in New Zealand who are going to be at the Olympics.
I was going to ask that.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm pretty happy with our scouting networks, and we do a really good job of picking up kind of undervalued players from some of the bigger clubs in Denmark, finding guys who, for whatever reason, aren't fitting in at other clubs. We have a really good environment and good culture at our club, so it's attracted a lot of players to come and play for us. So I'm really happy with the recruitment side of the organization.
Yeah, the New Zealand one was a standout for me because there was like three. I think there's three Kiwis there. Um,
Mhm.
how did that come about? Do you have a scout there? What's the relationship with New Zealand?
Yeah, so there's an academy called the Olay Academy, which is there's a big professional club in New Zealand, Wellington Phoenix, which I'm sure you're
Mm-hmm.
aware of, that play in the A-League, and then there's the Olay Academy, which basically all the other top players in New Zealand, they come through that academy. And I know the family that owns the Olay Academy, and they've been looking for
Right.
landing spots in Europe for a lot of their younger players. So I was able to connect with those guys, and we built a relationship over a couple of years. And we had a couple of the kids come in on trial. This was about 2 or 3 years ago. We really liked the quality of the players that came in. We knew they weren't going to be able to help us right away, but over a period of time that they were going to develop. So we signed two right off the bat. One, Callum McCowett, ended up playing for the Phoenix for 1 year and then signing with us. So it's a good pipeline for us.
Mm.
So that it's really based on just personal relationships I actually had.
Yep. Are you facing any competition for these sort of players and your own players from the Super League and clubs? Both in, I guess, your players that you've got now, and then when you're trying to sign young local talent.
Yeah, I mean, we always have competition. One of the other Olay kids that we were looking at ended up signing at FC Copenhagen. Certainly, there's always competition. We can't necessarily compete financially with some of the bigger clubs. So for us, it's
Mhm.
about creating the right environment for the players.
Right.
But we've kind of created a niche for ourselves in terms of the right player that we're looking for. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's competition, but at the end of the day, most of the Super League clubs honestly are waiting for those players to come into a place like Denmark, prove that they can be solid, good professional players with upside in Denmark, and then they'll usually buy the players
Okay.
versus they're not as inclined to take a flyer on a kid who hasn't had professional experience coming from the other side of the world as
Gotcha.
much as maybe we are.
Yeah. And is there a relationship between Helsingor and your other clubs, Swansea and Dundalk?
No, no. So I'm just a
Not at all.
minority shareholder in the other
Okay.
clubs. That's a passive investment. I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of the other clubs at
Okay.
all.
All right. I gotcha. Can you see Helsingor achieving anything like Dundalk did last season by reaching the Europa League group stage eventually?
I mean, not in the short term, obviously. I mean, for us, the first step is getting back to the Super League, which is a big step for us, certainly with our budgets and the size of our club, which I think,
Mhm.
it's not unrealistic, but it will be challenging. And then if we can do that, then it's about can we solidify ourselves at that level? And obviously in Denmark, I believe it's finishing in the top four, top five to make Europe. So it's not impossible, but I think it's not probably realistic in the short term or medium term in terms of what we're looking at.
Yeah, fair enough. You mentioned there your involvement with Swansea. How do you feel about the club just missing out on promotion last year, and I guess their sort of hopes for the season ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think it was a very good season. I think Brentford was a good team. It was only a matter of time before they were going to go up. So it was a
Mhm.
tough way to go out, but I think it's a strong side. I think Swansea's the kind of club that it's run well, has a good academy, is going to be competing to get back to the Premier League every season. So I think it's going to be another year, just like the last three, where the club will be right there for promotion, and it'll be a little bit of luck, a little bit of how the other teams are doing. So I mean, fingers crossed it happens this year, if not in the near future.
Yeah, awesome. It'd be great to see them back in the Premier League. They were an awesome club to be in there, especially having
Yeah.
Wales represented. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, can maybe I guess you're an investor at Swansea, but you're a co-owner at Dundalk.
Yeah, I mean, it's just in terms of I was on the board in Dundalk and I had to have
Yep.
a little bit of larger ownership stake, but both investments, I don't have any involvement in the running of
Okay.
the club or anything related to the club. So it's just passive. Um, yeah.
Do you have any idea about their aspirations and I guess your intent on what's your intent of being involved at the club with
I mean,
Dundalk?
right now any, I don't have any involvement other than just watching the games
Watching
when
the
I
games.
can, the clubs
Yeah,
and I don't, yeah, it's just the
fair
games.
enough.
Yeah, I don't have any comment on that.
No worries. Oh wait, 1 second. Internet's just cutting out. Oh, here we go. Now one thing I've really been keen to talk to you about is your links with the A-League club Central Coast Mariners. Where does that stand at the moment? Tell us a bit about your interest in the club and also your plans to possibly relocate Mariners to the Gold Coast.
Yeah. So I'll take like two steps back a little bit in terms of
Sure,
how
sure.
I got
Take as
involved
much
in
time as you
this.
want. Yeah.
Yeah. So I believe it was 2 years ago, the A-League went through an expansion bid process where I believe 10 to 15 different groups came in and put bids in for, I believe it was 2 expansion spots. And so myself and one of my business partners, Brett Johnson, who's involved in a couple different ownership groups, including Helsingor, he's on my board there. We partnered with the guys in the Gold Coast and put a bid in for an expansion group bid to bring an A-League team to the Gold Coast. Unfortunately, the bid wasn't selected. But we stayed in touch with those guys. It was something that we thought, was really viable. We really are still very interested in soccer in Australia, football. And so, we learned of this opportunity potentially in the Central Coast about 6 to 8 months ago, that the club was struggling a bit financially and the owner might be willing to sell, and there might be, an opportunity to relocate. And we started those discussions. It's obviously been challenging because the structure of the leadership in Australia has changed. It's gone to the owners group now, and they're dealing with a new collective bargaining agreement and new TV deals. So there's a lot of moving parts going on, and certainly the whole idea of selling a club and relocating it. There's a lot of discussions about that. So really, we're kind of in a holding pattern right now in terms of understanding what the long-term strategy is with the A-League. I would say, regardless of buying the Mariners and relocating it or whatnot, our interest is still very high in Australian soccer. So whether that's Central Coast or Gold Coast or whatever other markets there are, we believe that there's a lot of long-term potential in soccer in Australia, and so it's something that I'm hopeful over the next 6 to 12 months we'll be involved in some form. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's something that I've definitely kept my eye on for quite some time.
What makes you confident in the market, in the long-term market in Australia?
I mean, I think it feels a lot like American soccer and MLS was, 10 or 15 years ago. It feels very undervalued. And I think that the sport probably hasn't been marketed and commercialized properly. Certainly the Federation was running the A-League and it wasn't their number one priority. And now that you have the owners group that seems to be much more commercially minded, I think there's an opportunity to elevate the sport. I mean, it's the same as it is in the US, where soccer is not the most popular sport in Australia. You have kind of a core passionate fan base. You're competing with the global game in terms of European soccer. So I think there's a lot of similarities. And look, it's not something where you go in Australia and say, we're going to be able to turn a club around in 3 years and it's going to be this massive global brand. Like, that's not going to happen, right? It's one of these things where you need to come in and see the very long-term potential. I think one area where I think is really undervalued in Australia is the potential to develop and sell players. I think very few Australian clubs focus on the youth player market. And I think you do see a handful of players here and there going to Europe from Australia, but not enough, not anywhere near enough. If you look at the Australian national team, it's almost all players above 25, 27 years old. It's a much older crowd. So I think there's an opportunity, whatever club it is, for someone to come into Australia and focus almost exclusively on young players. And certainly with our connections in Europe, it's an easy pathway to develop those players in Australia and get them into the European environment and develop them. I think that's something we're interested in. So it's just trying to do things a little bit differently. And there's been some uncertainty, obviously, with the new television deal and the change in leadership. So that obviously gives us a little bit of pause because we're trying to figure out. We understand there's risk involved, but we want to understand what the certainty is in terms of how this business is going to look and how we're going to approach soccer in Australia. But I think even with the challenges and the risks, it's something we're really, really interested in.
Are there any other major changes you would make to the competition as a whole, looking from the outside?
I mean, I know there's this discussion about the season, whether to play in the summer or the winter. I mean, I'm not dialed in on the day-to-day as much in terms of how the calendar competes with other sports. I know that's a challenge and how that affects the weather. I think the league needs to solidify more franchises or clubs in as many markets as they can with stronger ownership groups. I think you have a core to like 6 to 8 very well-run, well-supported clubs, but I think you have a lot of stragglers, and there's certain markets. I think Gold Coast, I think, is one of them, where I think there's a lot of potential for an A-League franchise to do very well. And so I think you don't want to run into the situation where you want to overexpand. I mean, MLS has run into this. You could argue a little bit in terms of so many different franchises, but I think there needs to be a little bit of growth in infrastructure. I think you have legacy franchises that have done a very good job, but that's only going to take the league so far. I think the new television deal is really good for the league. From my understanding, it's going to give the league a lot more accessibility in terms of over-the-air television and streaming rights. So I think that's really good for the league. So I think the new owners group, even in a short period of time, is doing some really good things. So I think it's just about continuing to grow and bring in the next steps and continued investment in the youth side. There's a lot of different things. The discussion about having a national second division, that's a whole nother
Mhm.
discussion. There's a lot of different areas that I think need improvement in the space.
I'm sure you're aware of the failure of the first Gold Coast franchise in the A-League. I think it was back in 2008, 2010, around there. Probably wrong there with the dates, but yeah, only lasted a few years. Are you aware of that failure? And then what do you think you would do differently? And I guess Gold Coast has a history of failures with sporting franchises. What would you do differently there with your Gold Coast franchise?
Yeah. So my understanding, a lot of that failure came down to the owner. It was, rich. I think his name was Clyde Palmer. I think his name was
It
a
was,
oil,
yes.
and he was kind of a crazy
Yeah,
dude. I mean, you also got to look at the
he is.
demographics of the market. From 2010 to 2021, the population has grown almost 2x. There's several 100,000 more people in that market. Now I realize it's definitely more of a transient market for us. It would be comparable to like Florida, where you have a lot of people from a lot of different places. But I
Mhm.
think what is so interesting is two things: is A, you have very, very good infrastructure there, whether that's hotels, whether that's training facilities, stadiums. Obviously, you have world-class facilities. In the Commonwealth Games were there, so that's number one. Number two, the organization of the Gold Coast United, which was the shell of the former A-League club, it kind of reformed over the last 10 years as more of a grassroots organization where it has massive participation from the local communities in terms of youth, boys and girls, all the way up to an MPL side. So I don't know how many people they have in the organization and kids playing, but it's thousands of kids playing. So I think the prior Gold Coast United was much more of a top-down approach, where I think right now it's more of a bottom-up approach. And that's not to say that there won't be challenges. I think to fill the Robina with 25,000 people for the A-League right off the bat is not realistic. But I think it can be a good, solid market if done correctly with a population base. It's the biggest population base in Australia that doesn't have professional soccer right now. So I think that the bones are there here and now. And I think there's just a lot more potential than there was 10 years ago.
Yeah, the point you make, I guess, is the most frustrating thing for soccer fans in Australia is the youth participation is the highest in any sport, bigger than AFL and NRL, rugby league or union. So yeah, that is a thing you can tap into across the country, especially in the A-League, which for some reason there is a disconnect between young players getting through to those clubs and making sure there's a lot of talent available for professional football clubs to utilize. It's
I
definitely
think
something that needs to be
it's the
worked
same
on.
thing. It's the same thing we've seen in the U.S. over the last 25 years.
Yeah,
Is
it's
you still
comparable
have
there.
incredibly high participation rates. I think what changed in the U.S. recently, and we still have a long way to go, is now every MLS club has a professional academy. Now every MLS
Mm,
club has a reserve team in the second division. Right? You have the infrastructure to take that kid from 13 to 15 to 18 to 19 to the professional team. Whereas I
mm.
think right now in Australia, you don't have all that infrastructure. I think the coach of, I want to say, Western United, one of these Newcastle, one of the coaches came out and like he said, one of the issues of the league right now is just infrastructure, and I think that's just going to require long-term investment.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to have owners like yourself. I know Brett, having looked at Phoenix Rising and all the work they've done there, especially is very community orientated, and that's kind of what's been missing as well. I guess is finding a connection with local fans and local clubs. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
exciting times anyway. Are you just what are your thoughts on like big clubs like Manchester City investing in the A-League with Melbourne City, and then also I know Manchester United were also there were reports they were linked with the Mariners too. Um, what are your thoughts on that and big clubs getting involved in the A-League?
Yeah. So right off the bat, the Manchester United rumors with Central Coast were not real. Those were just rumors.
Okay,
Everyone I talked to said that was not something that was real. That was more just a
okay.
negotiating ploy. Um,
The
I think it's
negotiating employee
interesting.
for from Charles Worth, the owner of Mariners. Is that what you've
It's
heard?
possible. I don't know who put that out there, but no one in Manchester, from my understanding, has any interest in owning other clubs or being a multi-club portfolio. It's just not the way they do things at Manchester United. They have a different model, which makes sense. But
Sure.
the idea they're going to go to Australia and buy Central Coast Mariners is, I mean, it could happen, I guess, but it's not. I would be shocked.
Okay.
Um, I think where the stage the league is at, having a city football group own a club is probably a good thing for the league. They need good, solid, strong ownership groups, especially ones that have more of a global vision. I'm not in tune to the day to day of the club in terms of how they run that club. Do they invest? What do their facilities look like? I don't know that. I don't know the league well enough to answer that question. But I think at some point down the road, I would say MLS is in this stage with New York City FC, which same kind of thing. The league will outgrow those clubs in terms of the ambition. You're going to have individual ownership groups that are ambitious to invest. And want to do things beyond just a large portfolio and being a feeder to your other clubs. So I think in the short term and the medium term, I think it's good for the league. It helps the credibility of the league, but eventually down the road, I think they're going to need more independent groups that have a little bit different and more more motivations that are more aligned, I think, with the league, less so about just more of a kind of feeder for other clubs.
Yeah, different values, I guess. Just moving on a bit, you wrote in Sports Pro Media stating the Super League clubs should all be operating in black. The Super League proposed clubs. What do you make of the debt problems at big clubs like that, like Barcelona? And how do you think the authorities could improve, I guess, the financial situations and create more parity, I guess, in football?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see in North American sports is kind of salary caps and salary restraints, revenue sharing. I mean, none of this stuff is ever going to happen in Europe. It just doesn't, whether it's not legal with EU laws or whatnot, there's no interest in these kind of restraints. So we're not going to see parity. It's just not going to happen. And you're not going to see financial restraint from these clubs. They don't really have an incentive because they have incredibly wealthy owners who are just going to continue to fund these poor decisions and losses, or they're backed like a Barcelona by institutions like large banks in Spain or politicians where no one's going to let Barcelona fail. So I think La Liga in Spain, they do have some wage constraints, and you're seeing that with Barcelona in terms of they're running into some issues in terms of re-signing Messi within the restraints that they have from a financial perspective. But these big clubs make so many poor decisions for the most part. There are a handful of exceptions. I think that Bayern Munich is run quite well. Tottenham in the past has been run quite well. Liverpool, for the most part, has run quite well. So for the most part, these clubs are run well, but they just get more money from global commercialization and from television rights, and they just spend it more on players and buy more players. And sometimes they make good decisions, but oftentimes they don't. So certainly frustrating to see them kind of cry poor that they're struggling and they're in debt when really they're in the play. Barcelona's in that place because they just made bad decisions. So, that's just the way the world works. I don't see it changing anytime soon. You're not going to see this kind of strong oversight of the clubs from the league or federations like maybe you do in North America, because that's just not the way that things are done in Europe. So that's the way it goes. I mean, the A-League, for instance, right, has a salary cap and a salary floor, just like North America does. They have limits in terms of how much you can spend on marquee players. I mean, generally that's the way you want to create a financial model that makes sense. I understand it doesn't work for everyone, but like that is the model. That's how you make it a sustainable business.
Yeah, it's a lot of there's been some detractors for that in Australian football to try and get rid of that, to, I guess, incentivize clubs to spend as much money as they can to try and bring big name players and that sort of thing. But I agree. It's what's kept all the clubs going rather than your 3 or 4 big clubs from Sydney and Melbourne just completely taking over and dominating every year.
Yeah, I mean, with the market players and the ways they can still spend over. I think last I checked, Sydney and Melbourne are spending 6, 7, 8 million Aussie on players, and maybe Newcastle spending 3, right? So there's still a disparity there. But if you remove that salary cap, that disparity, instead of it being 2x, is going to be 5 or 10x, right? And that's what you see in European football right now.
Yeah, 100%. You touched on MLS there. I just want to get just some more, I guess, extended thoughts on where you think the competition stands at the moment, given it's been, 25, 26 years longer. Have you been impressed with the progress made? And do you yourself have any plans to get involved in ownership in America or Canadian clubs in the future?
I think it's made a lot of progress. There's no doubt about it. I think you're seeing over the last couple seasons more and more young players heading to Europe, and I think that's great for American soccer, for Canadian soccer, for the MLS clubs. They're finally, I think, starting to understand how to be on a global transfer market, understand how to develop and sell players. Some clubs do it better than others. I still think, MLS is a very compelling live product if you go to a match in person, but they still have huge challenges getting an audience on television, which, as we know, is the big driver of revenue in this sport. They still have a big challenge in many markets becoming relevant. So I think it's difficult to generalize the league because you have a handful of teams, let's say, are doing a really good job in developing players or building their brand and being very relevant, and maybe are on par with the other major sports in that market. And you have other clubs, like in my market here in San Francisco, where the MLS club is just completely irrelevant, right? So I think the league still has a ways to go. From a financial perspective, I think the challenge you have is there's such a scarcity of assets in North American sports to invest in that MLS clubs are just the prices are being driven through the roof. And it's difficult to justify the business case in terms of investing in MLS right now, in my opinion, based on the fact that the clubs are losing money. They're losing a lot more money because of COVID. The television ratings are quite poor. We'll see what the new television deal that they have looks like next season. But it's just a situation where I think the league is growing and it's doing a good job, but I don't think from a business perspective or an investment perspective, it makes any sense whatsoever for me personally.
What about USL?
USL is a little bit of a different story. I mean, obviously, we're talking lower price points. I think USL, in my personal opinion, is difficult, right? So you have no media rights right now. I mean, there's discussion about USL clubs developing, selling players, but you're really seeing very little domestic player transfer sales at all from a USL perspective. So I think if you're going to go in and do what Brett is doing in terms of finding a way to tie in real estate, so he has this new USL franchise he's launching in Rhode Island where they're doing a mixed use development, and that makes a ton of sense. But as a standalone investment, the USL, I personally don't think it makes sense either.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. It is encouraging though to see, I guess, the league USL doing well, and they're having a sort of two division thing. And it's with the second division in the A-League, what are your thoughts on getting that established? I guess there's a lot of questions in Australia about the financial investments going into those clubs. What are your thoughts on getting a second division going in the country?
I mean, I think it has to happen. There's no doubt about it. I think most people realize that. I think it's going to be really difficult. I was just reading an article about the gap between the A-League and the MPL. It's such a huge gap in terms of quality.
Oh, yeah.
It's just so far.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these second divisions, it's really difficult to figure out how you're going to get investment in when the financial model doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, maybe they can get a television media rights deal where there's some revenue there, and maybe they can go into some markets, Canberra or secondary markets that are looking for professional soccer. But it's going to be tough. You're going to be, in some ways, you're going to be like the USL, asking people to invest in the long-term growth of the sport and saying, look, you're going to have to invest 10, 15, $20 million over a period of 5 to 10 years before this turns into a real business. So I think that's the challenge that you have right now. At least the A-League right now, it has a pretty decent media rights deal. It has a built up brand. Like, you're buying into something that's very viable and present. A potential second division, it's very speculative. And I think that's the challenge. So are there investors? Is there a critical mass of investors in Australia willing to invest in the game? For instance, myself, I'm very interested in investing in the A-League. I have no interest in investing in the second division in Australia, zero.
Yeah.
So it's like probably not going to get a lot of foreign investment. So are there people in Australia in these different markets that are interested in investing in professional soccer at the second division level? I don't know that question. Right now, it seems like that's a difficult ask.
It's also a different, I guess, mentality towards sports ownership compared to the US, where it's not a common thing for a local businessman who's wealthy to start a franchise per se in a competition. They're all either established with community roots, ethnic roots, etc. It's not in the model of, I guess, business in Australia to buy a franchise and then start a division. So it would have to be completely changing the mentality towards sports ownership and what we view sports as compared to the American model. I guess we're a bit more traditional in that sense.
A good example is, let's just say the Gold Coast never gets an A-League club. They have an MPL club, and my guess is at some point they probably would want to try to make a jump to a professional second division. I mean, they're an amateur, basically youth soccer club right now with very little infrastructure outside of the youth game. So they would have to have a massive jump in professionalization and infrastructure to make that jump to a second division. Again, if there's someone locally who's willing to cut that check, great, do it. But are there 10, 15, 20 people in different markets throughout Australia willing to cut that check? I mean, now, the USL, as a comparison, struggled big time when they first tried this and launched this 10 or 15 years ago. They've gotten over the hurdle, and they've got a critical mass of clubs and investors who want to invest in the game. But I think we're a ways off from Australia having that critical mass.
Yeah, 100% agree. That's all I got for you today, Jordan. Thanks so much for speaking with us. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to help.
Thank you.